I remember a brutal trade secrets case early in my career where I found myself constantly sparring with an opposing associate. To him, every email was a battlefield, and every request was a chance to score a point against the enemy. One day, he demanded raw data from my client's home laptop. I actually tried to help him. I explained that based on his expert's instructions, the data he was asking for would be like gathering points on a map without any latitude or longitude, completely context-free and useless for trial. But he didn't hear a warning. He heard resistance. He became visibly irritated, convinced that my hesitation was just a tactic to make his life difficult or hide the truth. He was so obsessed with the immediate satisfaction of beating me in that argument that he couldn't see the trap he was setting for himself, so I stopped arguing and gave him precisely what he asked for. The result was a disaster. On the eve of trial, while we were all working 20-hour days, his expert finally admitted the data was worthless. They ended up exactly where I warned they would be. Sleepless, panicked, and adrift in a sea of misery. That attorney had won the skirmish, but he had completely sabotaged his own war. And as I look at the wave of regretters currently stunned by the unfolding consequences of the recent election, I realize that this wasn't just a legal mistake. It is a fundamental flaw in human psychology that is currently tearing our democracy apart. That opening anecdote, painful as it is to remember, it really distills the core question we're exploring today. Why are people, and why are entire political systems, it seems, systematically choosing the immediate satisfaction of the skirmish over the long-term goal of the war?
Why do these short-term tribal victories feel so much more, I don't know, psychologically rewarding than lasting stability or, complex policy success? It feels like we've all become obsessed with winning the argument, even if it guarantees we lose the objective. I think you've hit on it exactly. The volatility you're describing, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's really tempting to just blame it all on, say, social media or the current news cycle.
Right, the easy targets.
The easy target.
Yeah.
But if you connect this to the bigger picture, you find that this phenomenon is actually rooted in these deep, deep structural shifts. I mean, specifically the collapse of traditional social structures and the rise of a particular psychological framework that the modern political world is it's perfectly designed to exploit.
So that's what this deep dive is about, unpacking that.
Exactly. We're going to unpack that whole process by looking at two main pillars. First, the psychological core, this feeling of what sociologists call enemy, a kind of social normlessness, and this embrace of what's called zero-sum thinking.
Okay, and the second pillar?
The second is the structural incentives, particularly within media and political organizations, that actually reward this short-term, high-friction focus. Our whole mission today is to understand how all this individualized fear and anxiety is being harvested, really, and weaponized into political fury.
Okay, so to begin, we have to lay that psychological foundation. You mentioned the collapse of traditional structures. I mean, we're not just talking about norms changing a bit here and there, are we? This is something bigger.
It's much bigger. We're talking about a fundamental transition from a world of ascribed roles to a world of endless, and I mean really demanding, choice.
And that's the essential starting point for this whole thing.
It has to be. We're looking at a huge sociological shift from what you might call a traditional society to something termed institutionalized individualism.
Institutionalized individualism. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, think about the past. Your identity, your life path, it was largely inherited. It was assigned. You were born into preconditions. Your social estate, your religion, your community.
You knew who you were from day one.
Pretty much. Your class and your gender roles, they were often just treated as non-negotiable facts of nature. I mean, take the institution of marriage.
Yeah.
It was prescribed part of the social order, right? It was secured by material interests, and it was largely inaccessible to individual negotiation. Your life was defined by the parameters you inherited.
So stability came from that sense of destiny. You knew your place in the world, even if that place was restrictive or difficult.
Precisely. Now, the early chipping away at this rigidity, it started with the welfare state in a lot of countries.
How so?
By guaranteeing a minimum level of existence that went beyond just immediate family dependence, it kind of reduced the absolute necessity of family loyalty and interdependence. It subtly boosted the logic of individually designed lives.
So give people a little bit of breathing room.
A little bit. But the current version of individualism it's far more demanding. We are way past the liberation phase. We are deep into the compulsion phase.
A compulsion phase. What do you mean by that?
I mean that today, modern social advantages have to be actively earned and maintained. Success is no longer guaranteed by your birthright. You have to assert yourself in competition, daily. Your entire life trajectory has to be decidable and decision-dependent.
You're a mandatory entrepreneur of your own life.
That's a great way to put it. And this is qualitatively different from older ideas of anarchy, like, Emile Durkheim's idea of moral deregulation after the Industrial Revolution. This new individualism is institutionalized. It's built right into the rules of the game.
I really appreciate that distinction. It's not that the rules have disappeared, it's that the new rules demand that you constantly self-organize. You have to self-thematize your own biography.
Yeah.
The mandate is basically, you may and you must lead your own independent life outside the old bonds of family, tribe, religion, origin, and class. And you have to do this within the new guidelines and rules, which the state, the job market, the bureaucracy, and so on lay down.
And if you fail at this project of self-creation, the sanction is severe. It's economic precarity, social isolation, bureaucratic headaches. The system gives you the infrastructure, the job market, state services, but it imposes the responsibility for navigating it all entirely on you, the individual.
So the burden of choosing your own life, which on the surface sounds so liberating.
It sounds great, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it actually becomes the core psychological cost of this whole detraditionalization process.
It does. It sounds like we've basically traded the certainty of destiny for what you might call a tyranny of possibility.
I can choose anything, but that means I have to choose everything. And just the sheer cognitive load of that, it must be completely overwhelming.
It is deeply, deeply taxing. I mean, when life loses its self-evident quality, that intricate, call it a social instinct substitute that's provided by deeply ingrained routines and customs, it gets destroyed.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Just think about the mental energy we all save simply by doing daily tasks without some big existential deliberation, how we greet someone, how we structure our week, who handles what at home. Destroying that pre-conscious routine imposes what the sources call encumbrance, exertion, and stress.
The tyranny of possibility.
That's it. It's the anxiety that's produced by knowing you are solely responsible for decisions that have no prescribed right answer.
I can see how that leads straight to desperation. If I'm overwhelmed by choice, I might just start looking for any external authority, anyone, to relieve me of that burden.
Absolutely. And the overtaxed individual often flees into anything that offers relief. It can be magic, myth, metaphysics, or the self-help industry.
The psycho boom.
The psycho boom, exactly. The explosion of therapy, coaching, spiritual gurus. It's a desperate cultural attempt to drown out that fundamental question society now forces on everyone. Who am I, and what do I want?
So we're using professional services and complex belief systems to try and replace the simple inherited structures that the village or the church used to just provide for free.
We're not seeking salvation in the old sense anymore. We're seeking secular success, where healing replaces salvation as the central cultural expectation.
That makes the shift so tangible in the most private parts of our lives. The analogy of the washing machine dilemma in modern marriage it's particularly powerful here. Can you detail the sociological significance of that? The change from prescribed domestic labor to constantly negotiated labor?
That analogy, it really just captures the shift perfectly. Sociologists argue that in this detraditionalized life, a couple truly forms not just through, emotional bonds or a legal certificate.
Right.
But when two individuals merge their previously individual logistical lives, and that's represented metaphorically by buying one washing machine instead of two.
Okay, I'm with you.
In a traditional setup, the division of labor was largely prescribed, right?
Yeah.
Usually by gender, social expectation. The tasks were just done. You didn't talk about it.
Yeah, it was assumed.
Assumed. In the modern context, every single aspect has to be negotiated. What counts as dirty? Who schedules the wash? What standard of cleanliness is acceptable? Who manages the maintenance?
Everything is up for debate.
Everything is decidable. But you still need shared meanings and cooperative routines just to live together day to day. If one partner just accepts the burden and quietly handles the washing, they are swallowing what feels like an injustice, a transactional debt that the sources suggest will eventually, suffocate the relationship. That simple routine has now become a potential battlefield.
So the loss of routine doesn't actually lead to freedom. It leads to this perpetual intimate negotiation, which is inherently stressful. And this private stress, it must then get translated back into public anxiety and ultimately political fury.
That is the critical link. That's what we need to emphasize. When people are overwhelmed by structural conditions they can't grasp or tame, like global economic volatility or technological displacement, or even just the logistical complexity of their own family life, the compulsion to constant self-activity turns into desperation and blind rage.
And crucially, failure is no longer seen as a structural problem, is it?
Correct. Failure becomes intensely personal. It becomes individualized. The social safety net, which was supposed to guarantee a minimum existence, well, it might prevent starvation, but it does not prevent shame. Social problems, unemployment, addiction, poverty, or just that feeling of being adrift are systematically shifted off the collective ledger and right onto the shoulders of individuals. They get transformed into internal psychological dispositions like guilt, anxiety, and neuroses.
That sounds like what the sources call a mass sentence of isolation. If I believe my failure is entirely my own fault, how can I ever seek collective action?
You can't. You really can't. The result of all these fading social norms is the emergence of a naked, frightened, aggressive ego in search of love and help. The individual is just left lost in the jungle of the self.
Because their troubles don't add up anymore.
They no longer sum up into a common cause. They're seen as individual psychological flaws. So genuine, sustained collective action that's aimed at structural change it's virtually impossible.
So what do people do?
They seek re-embedding, they look for community, but they can't form deep, trust-based communities aimed at the common good. Instead, they find these fragile, short-lived PEG communities.
PEG communities. Okay, that's a new one for me. Temporary transactional affiliations. What distinguishes them from a true community?
Well, they're momentary gatherings around, and this is a quote, a nail on which many solitary individuals hang their solitary individual fears. They are highly specialized.
So they're not built on shared hopes, but shared fears.
Exactly. They are communities of shared worries, shared anxieties, or shared hatreds. They're driven not by a search for mutual stability or the common good, but by this desperate, immediate need for networking, for finding other people who validate their isolated psychological state. They exist to provide a temporary, aggressive form of shared meaning.
So this sets the stage perfectly then. The isolated, anxious ego, overwhelmed by responsibility, feeling personally responsible for structural failure, is driven to these temporary affiliations that prioritize the immediate emotional release of shared anxiety or hatred.
The skirmish victory.
The skirmish victory, right. Over the long, difficult process of achieving lasting policy stability. The internal breakdown demands an external enemy, which brings us to the cognitive engine of conflict.
That psychological desperation, it converts into political action through the lens of what we call zero-sum thinking, or ZST. This cognitive framework, it provides the justification for the skirmish. It assures that fragmented individual that aggression is not just necessary, but it's rational.
Okay, so let's define that. Zero-sum thinking.
We define zero-sum thinking as the ingrained belief in an image of limited good. It's the firm conviction that if one person or one group benefits, it must inherently be at the expense of others. There's no possibility of a win-win.
The pie is fixed.
The pie is fixed. The implicit fundamental economic view is that productive effort doesn't create new value. It merely redistributes a limited, static amount of societal output. So every slice someone else gets is a slice taken directly from your potential plate.
And this mindset isn't just a political talking point. This is a measurable, persistent psychological trait that we can actually track in people today.
That's correct. It is a robust psychological construct. Researchers can measure ZST by asking respondents to rate their agreement with statements across various domains.
Like what?
For instance, statements about wealth accumulation. Do they believe that if one group gets wealthier, it's generally at the expense of others? Or in the ethnic domain, if one ethnic group benefits, do others lose out? And in trade, if one country profits from a trade deal, does the other country necessarily lose?
And if they agree across the board?
The consistency of agreement across these different domains confirms ZST as this deep-seated belief system that then colors all of their subsequent policy views.
What's so crucial for our discussion here is how profoundly this mindset then dictates political choices, because it links that internal feeling of scarcity to real-world policy outcomes.
And the correlation is complex. It's actually a bit of a paradox. ZST strongly correlates with two seemingly contradictory political tendencies.
Okay.
The first is a demand for redistribution. Individuals who hold a strong zero-sum view are significantly more likely to support broad redistributive policies. Higher taxation, universal health care, income support for the poor.
That makes perfect logical sense within the zero-sum frame, right? If the rich are rich because they took the pie, the government needs to take it back and give it to the rightful owner.
Exactly. They believe the government must intervene to equalize outcomes because they assume the massive gains of the wealthy weren't created, they were unjustly extracted from the system. stolen from them.
Okay, so that's the first tendency. What's the second?
The second tendency is exclusionary identity conflict. ZST is also powerfully associated with supporting policies that restrict immigration and define the national in-group very, very narrowly.
For instance?
This includes views that immigrants should have to work their way up without any help, or that citizenship, or just being born in the U.S., is the most important factor for being considered a real American.
So the same zero-sum anxiety validates two different types of conflict at the same time. It validates a desire for complex structural intervention, like taxing the rich, but it also fuels this rigid identity politics of excluding the immigrant.
Yes, and that creates an intractable political situation, because you have groups wanting radical economic change, but defining their beneficiaries in the narrowest possible terms.
How does the mind bridge that gap?
The inherent perception of scarcity provides the logical bridge. If resources are limited, then the group that benefits must be my group, and any gain by an outsider necessarily increases my loss.
So both are rational responses.
Therefore, aggression against the perceived extractor, the wealthy elite, and exclusion of the perceived competitor, the immigrant or the outgroup, are both seen as perfectly rational responses to resource scarcity. The zero-sum mindset dictates the political boundaries of both the war and the skirmish.
If this is so powerful, we have to ask if it's just a reaction to, say, the current recession, or if its roots run deeper. Is this a trait that can be transmitted across generations?
Oh, the evidence strongly suggests that ZST is deeply persistent. It's transmitted intergenerationally, which makes it a persistent cultural feature, not just a cyclical political reaction.
Yeah, the sources identify how that happens.
Yes, they point to three key transmission mechanisms. First is economic conditions during your formative years.
Your childhood, basically.
Exactly. Researchers have looked at individuals who grew up in counties with high unemployment rates between the ages of 10 and 19. They consistently exhibit beliefs that are more zero-sum today. Those formative years, when you're absorbing the economic and social rules of your environment, they're critical. Growing up during long periods of economic stress or scarcity culturally imprints the idea that resources are limited and they're hard-won.
And the opposite is true.
Conversely, growing up during periods of economic success significantly reduces ZST later in life.
That is a staggering implication for generational politics, that the economic environment of my adolescence could be dictating my default assumption about how the world operates decades later.
It creates incredibly powerful baseline assumptions. The second factor is immigration history.
Okay, how does that play in?
We find that a family history of immigration, where you, your parent, or a grandparent was a first-generation immigrant, is associated with a less zero-sum mentality.
That's fascinating. Why?
It's a critical finding because it suggests that personal or familial success that is visibly perceived to come from creating new value, from effort and upward mobility rather than from extraction, it weakens ZST. These families often see an expanding pie because they have personally experienced that growth.
So a boom reduces ZST, and the personal experience of upward mobility, even starting from nothing, also reduces it. That contrasts pretty sharply with the third mechanism, which involves historical trauma.
Indeed. The third factor is perhaps the most profound: historical trauma. We can actually detect the persistent legacy of enslavement in the contemporary zero-sum mindset.
How is that measured?
When researchers measure the share of enslaved people in a county back in 1860 where an ancestor grew up, they find a significant association with more zero-sum mindset today.
We need to unpack that detail very carefully, especially the nuance regarding different populations.
Yes. The data indicates that this correlation is particularly strong for non-Black populations whose ancestors lived in those communities.
Why the distinction?
For Black Americans, the historical evidence suggests that the pervasive, multi-generational nature of discrimination, coercion, and trauma that extended far beyond the formal end of enslavement means that enslavement itself is less predictive of the modern ZST trait than the ongoing systemic denial of access. For the wider community, however, being immersed in a slave economy, a system built explicitly on the brutal zero-sum extraction of wealth from one population to benefit another, that culturally imprinted the idea that prosperity must come at someone else's expense. The system itself confirmed the zero-sum hypothesis for generations to come.
That is a staggering analysis. The legacy of that profound injustice created an environment that confirmed the belief for everyone in that region that if one group thrives, it must be because resources were stolen. And this inherited belief system then makes immediate aggressive conflict feel entirely justified.
It turns aggression into a rational defense mechanism. ZST provides the justification for immediate and often extreme skirmishes. We see this validation very clearly when you analyze support for political extremism.
Oh, jazz.
Well, consider the event of January 6, 2021. ZST is linked with significantly greater empathy and understanding for those involved in the attack on the U.S. Capitol.
And that's not just about party affiliation.
No, this empathy holds true even when you control for fine-grained political affiliation. If you operate from a zero-sum worldview, if you truly believe the opposing side is actively stealing your resources, your dignity, your country, then an aggressive, violent act to reclaim those things is seen as more justifiable, less extreme, than if you view the world as cooperative or even negative-sum.
This cognitive mechanism must also make conspiracy narratives seem extremely plausible.
Absolutely. The same psychological pipeline feeds conspiracy theories. Individuals who hold a more zero-sum view are significantly more likely to believe that narratives like QAnon contain some truth about U.S. politics.
And why is that?
Because the ZST psychology already frames the world as one where wealthy, secretive elites enrich themselves at the expense of the less wealthy and the less powerful. Conspiracy theories are fundamentally narratives about redistribution through exploitation. They fit seamlessly into that pre-existing framework of a limited good being hoarded by some nefarious outgroup, making them feel intuitive and highly plausible to that anxious, zero-sum individual.
So the zero-sum mindset is the pre-existing condition. It's rooted in deep generational trauma and early life economic conditioning. And it assures the isolated individual that their anger is righteous and their aggression is rational. But this psychology needs a mechanism to be exploited on a mass scale.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the systems that actually profit from all this tension.
And the rise of the zero-sum, fragmented individual coincided perfectly with the rise of systems designed explicitly to monetize that individual's anxiety and anger. And this is what we call the outrage industrial complex, or OIC.
This isn't just about partisan news channels, is it? This is a commercial machine designed to generate these high-friction skirmishes on demand.
That is precisely the design. Outrage has moved from being a spontaneous emotional reaction to being the defining emotional state of our era. It's the default emotion in modern political strategy.
Yeah.
The OIC it's a symbiotic ecosystem. It involves politicians, media personalities, partisan outlets, all of whom deliberately exploit the psychological state of their core ideological base.
Often the fringes.
Often the 5% fringes on either side, in a competitive, mutually beneficial cycle. The purpose is simple: rage profiteering. The goal is to harness that anxiety we discussed in part 1 and convert it into marketable engagement.
Outrage porn.
We are talking about outrage porn, or rage bait, where the consumer derives an actual chemical pleasure from being outraged at the stupidity or the malice of them, the outgroup.
And research supports that this is chemically rewarding, that it's basically an addiction.
It is. Polarized political discourse, specifically when it validates your shared anxiety and targets an enemy, is chemically rewarding. It provides a burst of dopamine associated with moral superiority, temporary social belonging, and emotional release.
It's the perfect hit.
It is the perfect, short-lived affirmation for the isolated, aggressive ego. It is a digital form of that ephemeral PEG community we identified earlier, only it's highly, highly scalable.
That explains the psychological demand side. But how does technology ensure that this kind of content is preferentially delivered?
Well, technology doesn't just enable the OIC, it institutionalizes the reward for skirmishes through its underlying business model.
The algorithm.
The algorithm. The primary engine of social media platforms is engagement, which is their revenue source. The algorithms, whether we're talking about Facebook's newsfeed or YouTube's recommendation engine, they're not inherently partisan, but they're designed to prioritize interaction. They privilege content that spurred prior interaction, regardless of its quality or its veracity.
This design then creates what critics have called hate-inducing architectures.
A powerful term, isn't it? They systematically reward and deliver incendiary content because controversy and antagonism generate higher clicks, longer viewing times, more comments than complex, nuanced policy analysis.
It's just better for business.
Much better. The algorithms, in their pure pursuit of engagement, invariably steer users toward more extreme content because the emotional intensity of extremism is simply superior in generating interaction.
So these systems are structurally hostile to the long-term work of governance. Let's go back to the anecdote I started with, about the opposing attorney who demanded the useless data just to score a point. The system rewarded his immediate antagonistic action.
The parallel is exact. The algorithm is the ultimate short-term reward mechanism. The long-term policy goal, winning the court case or achieving stable governance, that requires collaboration, careful research, compromise,
And all the
patience.
things that score terribly on an engagement metric.
Precisely. Antagonism, performative outrage, the immediate declaration of a tribal victory. Those are quick, they're cheap, and they yield a maximum reward right now.
The OIC ensures that political actors are financially and structurally incentivized to be skirmish winners. They have to optimize for the algorithm, which means prioritizing friction over functionality. This is a powerful feedback loop.
This is a vicious cycle.
The individual is fragmented and fearful. The ZST mindset provides the justification for conflict. And the media complex provides the profitable outlet and the structural reward for delivering that conflict instantly.
And this structural incentive, it doesn't just amplify existing conflicts, it fundamentally changes the nature of political competition itself. If antagonism is the highest rewarded metric, politicians must strategically shift the discussion away from complex issues that require consensus and towards simple zero-sum identity battles.
And this brings us to the final piece of this whole puzzle, the strategic weaponization of this psychological landscape in the political sphere. The very nature of political conflict has been fundamentally redefined.
It has, and to understand the shift, you have to look at the historical conflict landscape. Historically, political conflict was defined by two primary cleavages. First, redistribution. That's the class cleavage, focusing on the conflict between rich and poor over economic resources.
Okay.
Second, identity. The social values cleavage, focusing on conflicts between liberal and conservative moral values. Post-war politics for a long time were primarily dominated by that class and income dimension.
But something has changed.
Something has changed. The sources identify a critical inflection point globally, the rise of a new wave of identity politics. And this political shift is driven by two interlocking components. First, a growing base of angry, anxious citizens who identify strongly with their nation, their history, and a perceived traditional way of life. The nationalists.
And the second component.
The second is new politicians and political parties who aggressively push a populist, anti-establishment, and nationalist or nativist anti-immigration policy agenda.
So the discourse has strategically moved from competition over the management of structural wealth, which is the difficult long-term war focused on the economy, to zero-sum identity conflict, a highly volatile series of immediate skirmishes focused on defining who belongs and who doesn't.
And this shift is crucial because it allows politicians to tap directly into the zero-sum thinking and the psychological fragmentation we've been talking about. Policy choices, particularly around sensitive issues like immigration, they're no longer complex policy debates. They become emotionally charged identity signals.
A badge of belonging.
Exactly. They serve to accentuate citizens' sense of collective identity, making parties eager to compete for the nationalist exclusionary vote. It's an easy, high-engagement route to capturing the support of that isolated, anxious voter.
And the structure of political systems, especially the electoral rules, seems to facilitate this rapid pivot toward identity conflict. How do organizational differences reward these new identity-focused parties?
We see stark differences based on the electoral system. Research shows that in countries with proportional representation, or PR, systems, new radical right parties achieve much higher seat shares, around 13%, compared to countries with majoritarian or plurality systems, where they capture less than 1%.
13% versus less than 1. That is a staggering disparity. Why does the PR system make it so much easier for these nationalist, skirmish-focused parties to gain a foothold?
The PR system lowers the barrier to entry significantly. Because seats are allocated based on the percentage of the national vote, new parties that are focused on a single, emotionally charged issue like nationalist identity can easily enter the legislature.
They don't have to build a broad coalition.
They don't. They don't need to build broad, consensus-driven coalitions across diverse economic and social lines. They only need to mobilize that focused, zero-sum nationalist base. And this ease of entry creates competition where the existing mainstream parties are then forced to react.
And that reaction creates a huge strategic risk for the mainstream parties.
That's a huge risk. If they attempt to win back voters by adopting nationalist rhetoric, they face the risk of what's called endogenous mixing of candidates.
Meaning what?
Meaning that accommodating nationalist voters often requires backing up stricter policy proposals with a higher share of committed nationalist politicians on their own ballot. This introduces the risk of party takeover by politicians who genuinely prioritize identity conflict over complex policy.
So the cosmopolitan-led, policy-focused party, in trying to accommodate the nationalist base just to win an election, risks handing over the keys to the party machinery to the very people who reject consensus-driven governance. It's a self-sabotaging accommodation.
It is. And it creates a structural incentive for what is described as a discontinuous policy jump. This shift is not gradual, it is abrupt. When new nationalist social groups form, whether they are street movements like Pegida or highly effective political campaigns like those around Brexit,
Or when a new nationalist party enters the scene.
or when a new nationalist political party successfully enters the scene through a PR system, it causes a rapid, sharp shift toward a stricter anti-immigration or exclusionary policy.
These identity shocks quickly shift the entire equilibrium. The focus moves immediately away from the complex, long-term policy challenges, the war of economic stability and growth, and toward immediate zero-sum identity battles, the skirmish over borders, culture, and belonging.
The system is structurally susceptible to these shocks. The modern political environment, influenced by the OIC, ensures that the most profitable and high-engagement forms of politics are those that simplify complex problems into these zero-sum identity conflicts. This guarantees that we continue to reward short-term aggressive behavior that serves to deepen societal divides, even if it guarantees the eventual loss of social and political cohesion.
So to bring our entire discussion full circle, we started with the failure of a microstrategy, the attorney who prioritized winning an argument over the ultimate objective of the case. And this same flawed logic is now being replicated across all of society, amplified by these huge structural forces.
That's right. We identify the source of the political fuel. The contemporary individual is fragmented. They've lost their traditional social anchors, they're suffering a mass sentence of isolation, and they are desperately seeking the affirmation of these short-lived, conflict-driven communities that are defined by shared anxiety and hatred. The psychological vulnerability is profound.
Then we showed how that state is channeled through this pervasive zero-sum belief system. It's rooted in generational trauma and economic insecurity, which makes political aggression seem not just acceptable, but entirely rational and necessary.
If the world is zero-sum, conflict is justified.
And finally, we analyzed the modern system, the outrage industrial complex and political structures that reward identity conflict, which financially and structurally incentivizes political actors to just forego complex long-term policy solutions for performative identity-based skirmishes.
The system ensures that the short-term battle is always won, even if the structural war of stability is constantly being lost.
The ultimate implication for you, the listener, is that the volatility and fragmentation we see in our public life are not merely a product of disagreement. They're the predictable outcome of a profound structural shift that rewards immediate emotional gratification. The key is recognizing this inherent short-term reward system at play, driven by these fundamental changes in how we define ourselves, our relationships, and our communities. The psychological fragmentation of individual life is really what provides the necessary fuel for the modern political fire.
And this high cost of perpetual conflict is not confined to politics, because relationships themselves have become elective, negotiable, and constantly subject to conflict over gender, money, and time. As we saw with the washing machine dilemma, we are witnessing a potential war over the family. Every aspect of personal life has been turned into a micro-political battlefield. The systemic ambiguity and zero-sum conflict we see in public discourse are mirrored and indeed magnified in the most private spheres of human life, where love itself is struggling to survive what has been called the normal chaos of modern existence.